The context for this conversation is really around open source dependencies, the open source components that your developers are using to create your applications, your custom applications, right? Sometimes when people talk about open source, they think, open office and Firefox and Linux, and certainly that's one dimension of the supply chain. But I think it's helpful to recognize that the typical modern application is actually composed about 90% of components. Most of those components free and open source that developers have selected and pulled in from remote repositories like Maven Central, like npmjs and PyPI and Docker Hub and Ruby gems, and the list goes on and on. And this is a fact that sometimes is lost on leadership, especially leaders that we're used to writing every line of code like I used to have to do from the beginning. We couldn't just easily pull in a component and use it. We had to write our own network transports and all that fun stuff over and over again. Or if we did use open source, we had to pull in like the actual source and figure out how to compile it in our context, which was really oftentimes not worth the effort. So modern package managers, modern languages all produce these reusable building blocks, which has really accelerated modern development, made it cheaper, easier, faster to assemble things, which from a society perspective models most other manufacturing. And pick a car manufacturer, they don't usually also have a steel plant manufacturing the steel and every single part and electronic widgets and the silicon for the chips, right? There's a vast supply chain. And so modern software development looks more like auto manufacturing than a shoemaker did in the 1800s. And I think that's helpful for this whole context. And so, based on studies we've done, this number, 90%, this has basically been true for close to 17 years at least. So as long as we've been looking, this is what we find. The average modern application has at least 180 open source components. I would assert the number typically actually can be much higher than this, especially when you consider things like NPM, where JavaScript, the modern UI language, whether your server is in .NET or even C or Java, your UI is almost certainly JavaScript based. Those components are tiny, and so it's not unheard of to have 1,000 individual JavaScript components making up your UI infrastructure. And so understanding those and figuring out how to manage them, that's kind of the context for this conversation here. Tasha, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just, I would say that that's definitely true for financial services as well. And setting, I mean, most of our community will know this, but just to set the scene there, we know that financial services are huge consumers of open source, and that 90% number is something that our members have consistently confirmed. But it's also worth noting that some of the large banks, for example, have tens of thousands, if not 100,000 engineers, and they can have thousands of applications within their organization. So when you have thousands of applications, 90% and 90% of that is made up of open source, then you have large, a really large open source footprint within your organization. And anyone who doesn't know that, I think there are still a few people who aren't aware of just how pervasive open source is used within financial services, I think is really catching on. And I would also say that, although the industry has been huge consumers for quite some time, maybe not the 17 years, but certainly not far off, that contribution element is still a little bit
Mhm.
behind, but certainly we're, consistent with the numbers that you've shared.
Yeah, and for sure, the financial services industry, going all the way back to when we were pre-Sonatype working on Apache Maven, the finance industry was definitely early adopters to that. I think partially just because they were tended to be on the more of the bleeding edge ish, not the bleeding edge, but more on the bleeding edge than than other industries. I won't mention them, but certainly. And so for that reason, we always saw early adopters, early users of Maven. Certainly our biggest vertical always was financial services, and that continues. And so I think it's a double-edged sword though too, right? Like The new way of the world comes with new problems, right? Just like every other piece of technology, that adoption of the componentization of software made things better, faster, cheaper, not always safer, especially as we'll talk about the attackers started changing to exploit this. So this next chunk, this comes from the report that FINOS did, right, and released back in October. Tasha, I'll just let you cover these pieces here since it was your report.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. And so every year we do the State of Open Source and Financial Services report. We survey a large number of people in the industry. We speak with professionals, and consistently, we get results like this, that 88% of respondents say that using open source improves the software quality, and 84% agree that it delivers business value. And, in the 4 years that we've done the survey, that number stays consistently high. I think ways in which we are seeing, and I think it's well understood that it improves quality for, all of the reasons. I think specifically in finance, the way it's delivering business value is in a number of ways, sort of horizontally and vertically. If you look at, how it's highly regulated, financial services is highly regulated. So when they want to adopt new technologies and take advantage of what's coming out, they have to do it in a way that they know will meet the regulations, that will meet the high level of standards for their compliance and security teams. And so certainly there is an element of, finding that secure open source and making sure that you have everything in check that enables them to take advantage of all of the new things happening. So making sure that as an industry, they're coming together to look at how to adopt AI, how to go to the cloud safely and securely. And when you get a lot of people together across the industry with their slightly different views, then that collaboration really gives them a much safer, faster, better way to adopt these new technologies. And then, of course, they have to adapt to lots of financial regulations, and that can be super complicated and difficult to interpret. So if you, again, get people to collaborate together on those interpretations, you get a lot of value, faster time to market, more robust responses. So I think, and then we also see the value coming in through specific, more, I would say, vertical areas. So desktop interoperability, right? Every trader has lots of systems that they want to have on their desktop. Their engineers, their development team is always having to plug in new things because new systems are coming online. There's new algorithms. There's new people to settle with. And so having a fast way to do that interop, both between different financial institutions and software providers, can make a huge difference and is delivering a lot of value. So we see that in FDC3.
Yeah. Yeah. This part here also comes from that report. You were testing the confidence of how people feel like their ability to control and manage the situation is. And this is one we've certainly done a lot of studies on. And I think in many cases, because people don't know a lot of the nuance, they might be overconfident. But what were your findings here?
Yeah, I mean, you can see that most people are pretty confident, semi-confident, extremely confident. And I think that might be because there's also this sense that within financial services, again, because it's highly regulated, that the environments are very locked down. And I think maybe you can share with us some of your insights, but that it's perhaps not always as locked down as people might think, or that there's this confidence in the systems that are, the infrastructure that's underpinning the development in these big organizations, that they're really making sure that everything's getting updated. And like if you have thousands of applications and hundreds of thousands of, dependencies, then that's a really big estate to manage. And so, I think there's, yeah, maybe a little disconnect.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I'm going to get to some of those market trends and why I'm able to see what I see. People refer to me as jaded, but I think it's realistic in some of these cases. But this one here, we also found, like we did a survey in our annual State of the Software Supply Chain report and found similar things that when we surveyed management, 68% said they were confident, which more or less mirrors what you saw. But then from those same enterprises, when we assessed their actual risk of their applications through SCA, we didn't make this up. It's a coincidence that the numbers are exactly the same, but the exact same percentage were shipping software with known vulnerabilities that they didn't know about, right? So it just kind of shows that like confidence is not always well founded in this. What you don't see can hurt you. And that's kind of actually what this whole initiative is all about from the FINOS perspective, right? So one of the conversations that started probably about a year ago, actually, that Gab was pushing was to try to help understand how can how can Finos work with the member companies to understand what dependencies actually matter? Like where is the biggest consolidation of risk within the member companies? And because there are efforts that are happening in other Linux foundations. I'm a governing board member at the OpenSSF, and the mission there is more broadly to try to solve some of these challenges for all of software and all of open source. And so certainly, that helps FINOS member companies and the FINOS organization, but there might be specific things that more urgently need to be addressed. And so the question came up of like, how do we figure out where to focus on this? And so what came of it was this dependency consumption analysis member benefit that we're talking about. And so what we're able to do here is provide some visibility. So if I jump ahead a little bit, the context will start to make sense. So Sonatype, since our founding and even before officially being a company, we were the ones running and managing and hosting what was called Maven Central, the central repository. This is basically the repository where all of the world's open source components exist. There isn't another location that you can access from a package manager. So from a Java perspective, this is where all of your developers are getting things like Log4j, like Spring, all of these components. And the average financial services organization on the Java side alone is pulling hundreds of thousands of different components from our repository every year. And so that coupled with the other part of our business, which is, going back since the beginning, running repository managers. In fact, coincidentally, last night, my Facebook feed reminded me that Nexus Professional was launched 16 years ago yesterday. So it's old enough to drive a car, which is a little scary. Nexus Professional was the first commercial uh, repository manager. All the versions before that were only available as open source. And so that repository manager footprint that's deployed across hundreds of thousands of organizations worldwide also provides us visibility, because the role of a repository manager is to be sort of an intentional man in the middle between developers and the public repositories, so that you get visibility, so that you get benefits like it caches the downloads so they're not downloading them all over and over. If your internet goes down, your builds still work, fundamentals like that. But part of that analysis allows us to collect statistics of components that are in use, not just from Java, but actually JavaScript and Ruby and all these other things that are also going through the repository manager. So while we run the Java repo, we get really detailed visibility into what's going on from a consumption perspective in Java. We also have this visibility into a bunch of the other ecosystems. And then, of course, we also provide software composition analysis capabilities, and that gives us even more visibility into what's happening in a typical enterprise, right? And so the intersection of this with that desire to help FINOS member companies and FINOS as an organization understand what's important is we said, look, we can, with the right set of data and permission, we can work with your member companies to help you build the list of dependencies that matter for all of your organizations. So a goal of this effort is to help work with the member companies, collect all of the statistics into a different bucket that we can then reason about from FINOS and say, you know what, everybody is using this under-supported component. Maybe it's worth taking some of the money to help bolster that effort, right? And as a member benefit directly, the process of that allows us to work with the organization and highlight the things that we can see about how your own supply chain is being managed. So the best finding is we look at it and we go, everything is great. But this is where the jaded part comes from. I never find that scenario. We always find things that are surprising to the organizations. And what we also know is that detailed analysis if it's showing a little bit of, let's say, uncontrolled chaos within the Java ecosystem, it's going to be worse if you were to look at your NPM or these other ecosystems just because of the way those work. They tend to be even more chaotic, right? So it gives you a sort of a sliver of what's actually happening within your organization. And then some of those findings can help you start to make better decisions. So I'll
Yeah,
walk
I mean,
through a minute.
sorry, just before you jump into that, I think it, the potential value is really tremendous for members because again, we talked about this massive estate of open source and they have to figure out where to prioritize resources and what to do in lots of different areas, right? There's lots of different ways they have to invest those resources, even when it comes to open source. And so being able to pinpoint and then collaboratively work together minimizes the effort and strengthens the security for the collective, which I think is got a lot of upside.
That's right. So even in an instance where we find the diamond in the rough, where there is a supply chain and a member is doing all the awesome things and there's no findings, that corpus of data contributes to overall FINOS usage and then helps inform that, right? So there's benefit even if everything is perfect. But I would bet usually it's not. so so a little bit more, and then we'll jump into like what a sample report looks like and why some of the things are relevant. This, until very recently, was what the Log4j download trends looked like globally. And this one I think was the perfect sort of bellwether for what the industry, and not just the financial industry, but like software in general, what it actually looked like. And so you could see that in the early days, we pretty rapidly got to 40% of the consumption was of these fixed versions, right? So that red, what this whole thing is showing is the percentage of all of the downloads that are happening day over day of the different versions of Log4j, how many of them were known to be vulnerable, right? So the red means after the 0 day, people were continuing to download it at this percentage. And you could see even all the way on the right, a whole year later, still 45% of the versions being downloaded a year after the most prominent, most publicized, most attacked Java vulnerability was still 45%. Up until just like around the mid 2024, that was still 33%. So a third of the consumption 3 years later was still in this terrible situation. And we would find it in organizations doing their analysis. And everybody would tell us, like, no, we're not using it. It's been fixed. It's like, really? Then why are you downloading this 500 times a day kind of thing? Clearly it's in a build somewhere that you didn't know about. Right. So this kind of paints that picture of what we're trying to look for and the behaviors that ultimately need to change. If we look at the overall statistics of all the different top ecosystems, you can see here the number of projects, a number of different versions. It's staggering. In this year's report, we found, unsurprisingly, PyPI Python was the largest grower. You might have heard of AI. It's a little thing that happened recently. Most of that's in Python, which caused a huge year over year growth. But the point being that there's so many components for the developers to choose from. Those components are changing all of the time. As I'll get to a little bit later, the attackers are intentionally poisoning the well on this. And so it creates a very risky minefield to let the developers just wander around and pick components somewhat willy-nilly. So that's kind of the big picture here. Before I go any further, Tasha, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I think most managers in the financial services industry would say they're not picking willy nilly. Like we have systems, we have controls in place, and I'm sure that's true. But as you say, your analysis, your investigation, the facts that you've uncovered show that even if you are pretty well controlled, there's still ways for those things to get in, and still ways for developers to choose, versions that are good versions or, that have non-vulnerabilities. And and so it's still important to have a belts and braces approach, right? Have a controlled environment, but then also be doing that consistent analysis and evaluation of what's in your environment and how you can update it.
Yeah, and one of the it is a very fine line. One of the things that I have seen for a decade and a half it may not be that they're picking willy-nilly because they have things locked down, right? Or they aren't doing it because things are locked down. But what can happen in that regard is that the friction to upgrade actually makes it so that developers stay on an older version. Precisely like that graph I was just showing around Log4j. I used to, when I was warming up for a on stage presentation, waiting for people to filter in, and I'd always, I'd ask people like, who's still using struts, right? And this was like 10 plus years ago when it was already level 10 vulnerable for like 8 years at that point. And there's always people that would raise their hand. And I'm like, seriously, where have you been? Why are you using that? And they say, well, because it's on the approved list. And
Yeah.
it's so much drama to get the approval to move that in some cases, the locking down to prevent developer choice inadvertently incents them not to make the updates, which then increases your technical debt and leaves you vulnerable over time, right? So
Yeah.
the right answer is in the middle, and that's the
Yeah.
unfortunate.
That
Um,
is such an excellent point because I've definitely seen that happen many times, even experienced it many, many years ago.
yeah,
So yeah.
that's right. And that's where that analysis can kind of help. Like, is that actually happening? Because you'll see those downloads. So this is an example of a unnamed company, made up data. Maybe it might be real. I don't even actually know, which is better. But what we're trying to look at is historically looking at your egress IPs here in Maven Central. What are the patterns, right? So how many components are you downloading? Like how many times a month? And if you have a repository manager, what is the percentage of downloads going through this? And this is one of the most important things because organizations may say, we've got it all locked down. We have repository managers. We might have some of the Sonatype products to help filter out some of these things. But if you've got, in this case, a significant chunk of your portfolio going around the infrastructure, those developers are not benefiting from the real-time protections around the malicious components and other types of things, and you don't have the visibility. So that's where us being able to look at it from the repository perspective, we can see all of these things that may not be apparent in your estate, right? And that becomes part of that conversation. When we start to look at, how many things are you downloading over time that are known to be vulnerable at the time they're being downloaded? How does that fit? What's the trend there? Is it good? Is it bad? How does it fit against your industry? Right? Because everybody is doing this. Zero is not a realistic answer, but understanding if you're ahead of or behind the curve can drive an interesting conversation as well out of the report. And if you're using a repository manager, are there ones that are out there that you don't know about? Are there ones that are themselves on older vulnerable versions, right? So we're able to look at what the user agents are reporting from the different tools so we can give you that visibility, what tools are out there and where might the risk come. And one of these we'll show in a moment, like we can even sometimes tell you about the build tool versions that's out there. This is a different view of the same thing, vulnerable downloads. How bad is it? This is similar to that log4j graph to try to get a sense. And this becomes really interesting as organizations start to roll out programs. So if you imagined in the middle there, you started doing something, how did the behavior change of your ecosystem? So sometimes doing these reports multiple times at different points in time can really help paint a picture of if your process is working or not.
And I think that's valuable and where you need to adjust them. And I think it's just also worth noting that, you know, it's important to understand where your critical and high vulnerabilities are too, in terms of, again, adjusting those resources, looking at what you need to tackle first.
That's right. That's exactly right. This is a view. This kind of shows uh, the log4j scenario again, and showing that there can be stark differences between organizations that are treating things differently. Like I showed before, the industry average was fairly flat for a very long time, but companies that do actually do a good job of this, you can see here in the green, remediated 80% of it in 4 days, right? And then continued to update to the fixed version every single time they came out because they had good supply chain management controls. So there is reason to believe if you're doing a great job of this report would also show that, which I'm sure managers love to see as well. To say, see, we are ahead of the curve. We're doing a great job.
Yeah. Yeah.
Keep doing it, right? Yeah, so this is a report. This again, this is just a sample view of the log4j. We focus in on a couple different ones. I think there's one that shows even the spring, because we tend to try to find these big ones that are widely used enough that can allow us to benchmark you against where everybody else is. Um, we could do a word cloud so you understand which of the components are out there that are the most vulnerable, so you can start to go find out who's using those, why they're using them, and start to plan about how to remediate this. This one here kind of gives a breakdown of the user agent, like I was talking about. So ideally, you would only see downloads on these public repositories coming from a repository manager, because in an ideal state, everything is being funneled through that single choke point where you have controls in place. So you shouldn't see directly these user agents, but if you are, where are they coming from? Which part of your portfolio is leaking or working around the repository? And I had conversations recently with a financial services former developer. And, it was interesting to see the epiphany around some of that, because he was thinking, I'm trying to achieve the business goals. I'm trying to get my job done as fast as possible. And sometimes the infrastructure feels like it's in my way. And so I feel like I'm doing the right thing by changing my config to go directly to the repo so I can get the stuff I need and it's faster and it makes my job easier. Problem is, they haven't yet across the board understood the risk that comes with that directly working around that infrastructure puts them on the bleeding edge for attacks, and I'll talk about that in a minute, right? So it's interesting to remind ourselves that developers working around this infrastructure, they're not usually doing it because they're trying to do something wrong. They're actually just trying to get things done faster, and they think they're doing a good thing when in fact actually they're doing the wrong thing. And so again, this type of analysis can help tease that out. We can also give you, not only the user agent, but IPs. So where in the world this is coming. Funny story. We had this conversation a financial firm, 10 plus years ago, and they were somewhat in denial. They didn't understand why the data we were showing them about all these vulnerable. They were like, that can't be happening. And then they thought, oh, it must be happening only in our overseas contracting centers. And it's like, okay, maybe let's look. Oh, you know what? Those IP numbers are coming from the US. And then the conversation shifted to, well, that's because they're like on VPNs. It's like, great, let's look at the time of day that that's happening. Actually, it's happening in like US East business hours. It is not happening in like India or, whatever business hours, right? So a lot of this again can help kind of quickly ascertain where in your organization the problem might be. And that's
Yeah,
why
and
these
correct
reports,
any
yeah,
assumptions that are
that's right. And that's
invalid.
why these reports end up, we like to deliver them as a conversation because we can approach it iteratively. If like a finding is really shocking, we can go back and like slice and dice the data a little bit to help really zero in on where the problem actually is. I'll move a little bit more quickly through these ones. This is a Spring for Shell, same thing. But what we tend to do when we look at the resulting report is driven by the data. So if we're not seeing anything interesting for Spring for Shell, you're not going to see this slide. But if we see something else, we're going to focus in on that, right? So being able to understand, even from a licensing perspective, most organizations try to shy away from the Affero GPL license because of some of its extra copyleft protections. You might find those things. So it's not only about insecure components, it can be simply components that are violating your policy for whatever reason there is, right? And then again, how many shadow downloads are going around your repository. So we break these down, we provide these custom observations for the organization, all with trying to drive that conversation where it needs to go. This particular one was showing, again, your infrastructure is a little bit out of date from whatever this looks like. This came from February. You could see they had many repository managers, some of them running versions that were multiple years old that may have had patched vulnerabilities. So, some of this can shine that light again on what your infrastructure looks like, not just what the developers are doing. And then we summarize it, right? So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to help work with you to provide that action list. And again, all of the data that comes from this, in terms of what components are being used, not the supply chain specifics and all of that. the actual components being used, how frequently they're being used. That's the data that the FINOS organization is looking to try to collect so that we can then understand the most popular framework, the most popular UI piece, the biggest vulnerability that affects all of our member companies. What are those? And then that would lead to additional initiatives to try to help improve that. So that's how all of this kind of fits together. Anything you want to add? Okay.
Right.
The other aspect of this, I've kind of alluded to it a few times. This is something that's a little bit more recent, although I feel like it's been a long time. I first started talking about this in 2017, so what? That's 7 to 8 years ago. So it's not that new, but yet I think it's new to a lot of folks. The landscape of open source supply chain attacks, right? So in 2017, we saw this new trend of components that were being put into these public repositories that had no purpose other than to cause harm, right? So the focus up till then, and even it didn't become sort of mass media hysteria until around SolarWinds and Log4Shell, was about these unpatched vulnerabilities and how quickly you could remediate these. And as we showed, the world's not doing a great job if it took 3 years to get below 30%. That was like last year's or last decade's battle. The attackers had moved and said, we're going to exploit the fact that many of these supply chains are unmanaged, uncontrolled, and we're going to start putting fake components out there. And so that started in 2017 and it exploded year over year. Just in the last year alone, there's been over 350,000 intentionally malicious components that are published out there. So I think this is starting to become a little bit more generally accepted, but it's something that I've been trying to educate people on for basically 8 years now, because we could see that the biggest part of the risk in modern development was actually coming from this. And so in this year's report that we released back in October, um, at that time, the number of known malicious components cataloged was around 700,000. I checked as of yesterday, it's already 800,000 plus now. In that same report, using the analysis that we did across all organizations based on what's being downloaded, what's in the applications across not just Java, but all the ecosystems, it turns out it's about 750,000 components in all of those things are the ones that are typically used every single day, right? So there's millions of open source components and projects out there, and most of them don't get used at all. 750,000 of them are the ones that typically you would find in any given application. We're already at a point where the number of intentionally fake malicious components is actually bigger than that. And I think that's an interesting inflection point when you think about what the minefield looks like, right? And so this continues to happen. And of course, I don't have a slide here that shows the growth, but it doubled last year. It had grown through 750% each year for the prior 3 years, right? So it's a hockey stick growth kind of thing. And that just shows that the industry at large is not really combating this. And we've seen some organizations that we work with that had controls. They understood about this problem. We worked with them and provided them the data to actually look inside their repositories, and they found dozens of intentionally malicious components that were already there. They found that those components had existed across tens of thousands of actual deployed systems. And at least one case, I know of a company who analyzed software that they purchased that had a malicious component baked inside it, right? So the fact that you haven't heard about this happening in your organization probably doesn't mean it's not happening. It's because you don't have the ability to actually look. So it's invisible. It's like the invisible radon gas we have in New England. Just because you can't smell it or see it doesn't mean it's not there.
Yeah. And I think you made a point, in some of our earlier discussions about developers might, if they're not putting something to production, if it's only for internal use, then there might have been slightly less concern about, understanding all of the vulnerabilities. But certainly when there's an increase in malicious attacks, then that no longer holds water. I mean, you have to be aware of what's in your walls.
That's right. And that was sort of that point of the engineer I was referencing before, when there's a process to approve a component, you know, you tend to want to try before you buy. You want to know if the component actually does the thing before you go through the hoops to get it blessed and approved. Well, how do you do that? Sometimes that requires you to work around the process. Well, guess what? That's what the attackers are relying on, that you're going around directly to these repos and they're going to trick you. It's another way to think about it is it's a phishing attack on your developers using the development infrastructure, right? They're tricked into downloading a fake component because it has a similar name, or it used to be a real component and now via various mechanisms it's now used to deliver hostile stuff. We've seen all of the things, and the target is actually usually not to try to get those components into applications that get shipped. The target is the development infrastructure because the environment variables might have keys, database keys, AWS keys, all these kinds of things that get sent off to foreign actors that they'll come back and exploit it, right? And so that's kind of the point. And that's why doing that analysis to understand how much of your portfolio is actually working around any of these choke points, that is a surrogate for how much risk you might actually have for these next generation types of attack. That's why understanding that is so important here, right? So of course, we have protections for this. We can work with organizations. We try to educate people on what's going on to help with that. When things are going through a repository, we're able to use real-time data to know ahead of time what components are out there in the world that are known to be malicious or are suspicious enough. We use behavioral techniques looking at open source projects and commits, and we can detect when things are fishy. We actually, when I was scratching my head all the way back in like 2017, thinking about how can we get ahead of this? Because when the community finds out that something is malicious, it's days to weeks later, everybody was getting exploited. In the meantime, we have to figure out like the vulnerability 0-day reporting mechanism is not fast enough. How do we do this? Actually, we borrowed from the financial services industry. We took the model of credit card fraud detection, where you can't always know that a specific transaction is fraudulent, but you can know that, for example, I travel all over the world. My credit cards get used for travel things, but I don't go to another part of the world and try to buy 10 TVs. Like that transaction is going to get flagged now before I even complete it, right? I'm probably going to get a text from my bank saying, this is weird. I blocked it. You need to approve it, right? And so we recognize that while we can't always play the cat and mouse game of know what the next malicious component actually looks like, we know what normal open source software development looks like. And so we can build models to detect that. And so when something shows up, that's weird. So an example, um, I'm still a committer on Apache Maven. I haven't written code in a long time, but if suddenly a release from Brian appeared in the repository where I haven't done any releases in 15 years, that might be weird. It might be weird if it came from a different part of the world that I've never done a release from, or a different time zone that I've never done a release from, right? So these are signals. They're not guaranteed that they're malicious, but they're enough that if it were a credit card transaction, you'd stop the transaction and ask for confirmation. And that's basically the model that we've built. And that's how it works, right? So we know about these things within seconds of them hitting public repositories. Then, if your developers are going through the infrastructure and one of these things is in the confirmed or at least in the suspicious state, you can basically quarantine it and stop it from getting on the developer machine. Because if you allow that download, that's when the payload actually triggers. So if you found it 10 minutes later, it might be too late. The data is already somewhere you wish it wasn't, right? And so that's what we're trying to do there. And so this, again, part of the sample report, we're trying to provide, customized guidance on what we see. So this is a little bit of a summary and a punch list, if you will, of how to attack that problem and what your call to actions might actually be, again, given your circumstance. So that's kind of all of the stuff. That's sort of a preview of the conversation that we can have with your organization if you choose to produce that report. And then again, doing that would actually provide the data to help FINOS understand what projects to help focus on lifting up and what problems need to be solved. So anything you want to add there, Tosh?
No, I just think it's really important to understand, and that the opportunities collectively are pretty big.
Sure. And then just before we go to questions and answers, we've also rolled out capabilities for FINOS projects themselves. So a lot of that data, a lot of that stuff that I've talked about, we've made it available for the open source projects, the parts where the member companies are coming together to jointly develop these things like Morpheer and a bunch of other projects are already using this. So we're helping those projects make better decisions, make fewer mistakes around the actual components that are going inside those things. And so we're helping from that perspective as well. So this is just a little bit of a glimpse of some of the data that gets provided back to those teams to make those projects safer for all the member companies.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the things. The membership in FINOS has grown significantly, quite significantly, 20% year over year. We now have 100 members, and the projects and the number of contributors and participants continues to scale that way too. And I think part of that reason is because when you come to a foundation, you are expecting that you get more secure software, that what you're collaborating on is being closely scrutinized and evaluated, and that the active participants are very well known, that it's a vibrant community. These are some of the things you talk about in your report as well. How do you should look at the community there. You can't do this for perhaps every single tool that you want to, every single piece of open source that you want to use, but in looking at big projects, how vibrant is your community? How frequent are updates made? How quickly do maintainers respond? And so I think part of the value that foundations can provide is that sort of environment and community, and also just, like minds improving the software at a faster pace, delivering value for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I did just, go ahead. Go on.
I was just gonna say, with some of the legislation coming over in Europe, like the CRA and stuff like that, the Cyber Resiliency Act and the Product Liability Directive have implications for foundations. So, for the communities, the foundations I think are going to be expected to do these things if they're not already. So I think it's going to be a little painful for the ones that aren't doing it, but I think it's ultimately what's needed to be done to make the software better for everybody.
And it's not all doom and gloom, right? That, there's a lot of information that's getting, like your report, it's obviously gets the word out coming in doing the webinars.
Yeah.
Certainly at we have a large conference every year, the Open Source and Finance Forum in both New York and London. And looking at the content, there's usually a whole track that's discussing, how do we safely consume and contribute, to open source. And some of our organizations really get it. They're really locked in. And then others are, newer to really fully engaging with open source. And so they maybe need to hear this information because it's not as known to them. We have we talk about a maturity curve, and our members span the curve from just starting out to really being quite mature. But I do think there is training available, right? There are tools that we can use to help educate our engineers to make good decisions. And obviously everything that you just discussed can really shine a light to management and the engineers on where they're, having successes and where there's room for improvement.
Yeah, and I wish I included the visual in here, but it is something I use often, and it's in a couple of our reports. But we did a study. It's a couple years ago now, but we looked at organizations. It was similar to that 68-68 study. In fact, it might have been the same study. But what we looked at were organizations that were prioritizing security above all else versus organizations that prioritized going fast above all else. And so, people expect me to convince them that you should prioritize security above all things. But what we actually found was organizations that were mature in their supply chain, and they balanced being secure and going fast. They were actually more secure than the ones who only cared about security. And they were also faster than the ones who only cared about going fast. And that's a shocking kind of realization until you break it down. When you only care about security, you can end up in that situation I described before, where the bureaucracy actually slows down developers and then incents them not to upgrade, which can then increase the risk, right? So when you only focus on that, and of course, when you only focus on going fast and something like Log4j happens, you still have to fix it. You're just wholly unprepared to do it. And so it becomes even more disruptive. So the answer is actually, if you do this properly, you can be faster and more secure. And we've typically it turns out to be about 30%. So you can be 30% faster or 30% more efficient to invest in the actual business value and not spend so much time reacting to, the ever increasing list of vulnerabilities. So it I'm glad you brought that up. It's not all doom and gloom. Actually, when you do this better, you become a better manufacturer and all the things that come with it. Better, safer, cheaper, more efficient come with it. So okay, so we have a question here. How do they request this report? We should have put that in the slide, but there is a page on the FINOS website somewhere for members, yeah?
Yes, and let me grab the link actually. Pop it in. And if not, you can reach out to member success who can also help you. But I will put the link in.
Are you seeing any other questions coming in?
Oh, well, so one question that we have is so how do you start tackling blind spots in dependency management if you don't have a centralized system in place?
So I think understanding where those blind spots are, that's what we're trying to help here. And then it depends. Usually it's a combination of, you don't have controls in place, developers are inadvertently or advertently working around the infrastructure. You may have those controls in place, but yet they're still making poor decisions. So you may, even in a scenario where 100% of your traffic is coming through an approved, repository manager, the things they're pulling down might still be things you wish they weren't, right? So it implies a different part of the problem. So I think knowledge is power. Getting that visibility and the understanding helps then guide what the next steps are. You know, if you don't know what the underlying cause is or where it is, you don't know which treatment to apply.
And everyone, just as a reminder, please feel free to take advantage of the chat and the Q&A boxes if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to get to them. Another question that we have here is, so what's an effective way to encourage developers to use better dependency management practices without slowing down?
Mm. So we try to advocate and provide capabilities and tooling for empowering the developers with the information to make better choices. It's no good to play fetch me a rock game where they don't get to know what's on the secret list of criteria until they ask for it and then they get told no. Being able to provide them, the same tooling to assess a particular component or a particular component version and its consistency with the policy is we believe the right way. We don't want to waste anybody's time. So some organizations roll that out, with sort of like a block list, an approved list, and then there's something in between. Where that can help is you can give visibility to developers that would let them conclude on their own, this thing is not yet approved and it's not going to be. And this other thing is not yet approved and it might be, but just like it, there's one that already is. And so, and we've seen cases where organizations found that developers were asking for approvals on a ton of stuff that went away as soon as they had easy ways to see which ones were already approved. So, because it just saves everybody the time, both the people trying to do the investigation and also the developers of wasting their time. So, being able to integrate that into the tooling, into the IDEs, into the code review workflows, and give them that policy based information is what's really important. And that policy can encompass from an organizational perspective all the things we've talked about: the security, the presence of vulnerabilities, the maliciousness, what the license is, what the quality of the project is, if it's foundation supported or company commercial supported. All of these things can go into a policy that you can then use to help guide your developers to make decisions in the direction you wish they would. It doesn't always have to come down to we're just going to break their build whenever they make a mistake.
And I think we do have a lot of member firms who it's very common in financial services firms to have mandated training on all sorts of different things. I mean, every year I had to take the same training. I worked at a bank for 18 years, and every year some of the training was the same, and maybe it got a little upgraded. But we do see a lot of our members having training specifically on open source and how to engage with open source and what to look for and policies and the processes. And, I think that's valuable. Sometimes it's mandated. Sometimes it's not. Maybe it always should be. And general best practices for development, that there's also training on that. but I think it's also, picking up on some of the things you said, that can't be the only thing, right? You can't be here, do your training session and make sure you always make the right decisions now. A, because you're just not going to absorb all that information. And B, because, it's as you were talking about before, developers want to get the product delivered to their end users, right? Because that's how they get paid. That's how they, feel good. And so embedding some of those processes, some of those protocols, those policies into their existing development patterns makes it much easier for them to be compliant, more successful, and for the firm to ensure that their policies are implemented. So I don't think it's just enough to. I mean, you have to have a policy, but then it's how you integrate that policy into day-to-day practices makes a big difference.
We have a question from security team Soti. Largely just kind of wanted to reach out and learn more about the product and kind of how into their business workflows. So we can make sure to get connected after the call. Next question. I have a question from myself here. So one thing we've been talking about in some of our AI readiness calls and from the AI readiness SIG is a lot of things that are published as open source in the model world. There's some vulnerability where things are getting trained on things that aren't necessarily open. And so things are called open that it's a licensing dependency issue. And I'm wondering if this is something that could be kind of solved and visualized using kind of these dependency management tools.
Yeah, I've been talking very generically about components here, but the AI models, AI components, they're kind of the same. They're a subset of this same problem. And so, yes, we have capabilities that can flag malicious models, models that have licenses that, might have terms that you can't use, these types of things. And so I would describe that as an important subset of this. So basically all the things I said can apply and do apply to the models. They're usually Python, but not exclusively. And we have capabilities for that as well.
And then our last question, unless anyone puts anything else into the Q&A box. So for financial organizations with legacy systems, what's the best way to start integrating tools like the ones FINOS offers?
Right. Before you jump in to answer that, I'm going to make it more complicated for you. Curveball. They can also be huge. So not only have legacy systems, but really have siloed, you know, siloed areas of development as well. So it can feel, I guess, sort of potentially daunting to try and tackle this problem.
The answer is it depends. It depends upon how your supply chain is currently designed and where the most logical choke point exists. So we develop systems so that we could integrate with the source control, GitHub, GitLab, etc. That might be a great place to begin to assess. So generally, where organizations get started, and we kind of call it audit mode. We're going to get in and we're going to try to understand what's going on. We're going to build a deeper picture of the dependencies and where your problems are, even deeper and more encompassing than we can do just from the central report, because now we're actually looking at your actual applications. So some organizations that could be a repo manager. Sometimes it's a source control. Sometimes it's hooking directly into the CI builds. The CI builds actually is the best place because then we get the most precise information. It's not just theoretically what could go in the build, but it's what actually goes into the build. So it's like inspecting the car, not the bill of materials, right? But for some organizations, that might be too hard, or maybe there's too many different CI systems or whatever. And that's where you look for where can we get the biggest cover with the fewest actions to get started. And then usually that becomes self-fulfilling because once you can start to see that visibility, then people crave it in other places and it will get pulled into other parts of the infrastructure. When you're in a place where you can actually start to move beyond auditing and actually taking actions against the most egregious things, blocking malicious components, maybe blocking level 10 vulnerabilities, these types of things, then can help create a pull scenario where the developers will say, I'd love to know ahead of time, like I was describing before, that the choice I'm making is going to block a release or that this thing happened overnight and I need to deal with it before my next release. That's a case where you might integrate into the issue tracking system so that it gets on their work list, right? So there's a lot of different ways, and we had to develop the system that way because of the experience, knowing that every organization is a snowflake. They have common problems, but the way you attack it can be a little bit different in sequencing. The way you end up usually looks very similar, but it depends on where you are, and we need to meet you where you are. So there's no one size fits all answer, but there's lots of approaches. We've seen them all, and so that's where we can help guide through that process.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. I think that should give the nice and nuanced approach to our members who are in our community who've attended today. We are at the hour now. So a big thank you to the very large number of people who attended. I think this is probably our most well attended webinar so far. So thank you for everyone who came. Thank you for everyone who stayed through the full hour. And thank you to everyone who asked questions. With that, this is the Sonatype on the third open source in finance webinar series. Again, this is a member benefit for our FINOS members. And if you would like to be featured in an upcoming webinar series, please contact member success so we can start beginning those conversations.